So for those with us so far, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you also for those of you that have shared your questions. There's some really good questions on there, which we'll get to later on. But we today are holding a webinar called Leading During a Time of Crisis, a conversation with Nigel Armitt. Nigel is the interim CFO of Amnesty International. He has a wealth of experience in senior finance roles within the charity sector and also in dealing with crises. He's also a really great guy. So thank you very much, Nigel, for joining us today. And I'll hand it over to you so you can properly introduce yourself.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today during these, which we still keep referred to as uncertain times. I found the last 3 months, 4 months now, I'm losing track of time, as I'm sure many of you are, being very challenging times, and have been times when, as a finance person, we really have had to step up to the plate, as it were, and perform. It's all the back office services that have had to come to the fore and run the organisations that we're all employed by, engaged in, to keep those organisations moving forward. So it's been a very interesting time. As been explained to you, I'm currently interim CFO at Amnesty International. I've worked across Europe, worked in the Middle East 9 years, and I would say my approach to this particular crisis was one of looking at it as a turnaround situation where organisations are in financial distress, because that was the sort of mindset that one had to think about to get us through this this very difficult times and very challenging times. Thank you, Rob.
And just to quickly introduce myself, Leanne, and Altum Consulting. I manage the charity finance team at Altum Consulting and have recruited finance professionals into the charity sector for the past 8 years. And I work with Leanne, who can introduce herself.
I joined Altum just shortly after Robbie, about 2.5 years ago, and been working in charity finance recruitment since moving here in 2016. And we are both active members of the Altum Foundation, which supports a number of charities focusing on children and young people. We've given our time to the Sphere programme through the Resurgo Trust, and we've also ran the Sierra Leone Marathon for Sweet Child.
Great, thank you, Leanne. So Nigel is going to talk us through the things that he's seen as most important during a time of crisis. And then after this, we'll be running through some of the questions that you've shared when registering for the event. Throughout, there will be an option to enter any questions you have in the chat box, and we'll try and keep an eye on that. And if there's anything particularly pertinent, we'll try and ask Nigel throughout the presentation. If we're unable to, we can ask those questions at the end. But let's get going. So, Nigel, can you please talk us through your experiences in prioritising during a time of crisis?
Yes, thank you, Robbie, for that question. That was something that presented me from day one, when I suddenly found myself having to move from the office and move to work at home when everybody went into lockdown. And I found the first thing I did was to create what everybody should do at a time of crisis like that, is to come up with your priority list and decide what are your priorities on a day-to-day basis, so that you can focus on those priorities and make sure that everybody else in the organisation knows what priorities you're working with and whether in fact they align with what the priorities are of the organisation. Because pre the crisis, I'm sure we were all working other priorities. Therefore, the actual COVID-19 crisis wasn't something that was on our priority list. As soon as it happened, as I say, my immediate thoughts were survival. And following that, then I thought, being a finance person, cash is king. And what needs to happen is we need to think about the next 6 months. The next 6 months of the planning horizon, and the next 12 months at most, is the period that we should be focusing on. We shouldn't be thinking about 2021. The first of all, our priority is to get through 2020. And that's exactly what I did. And I made sure that when I was talking to my finance team, talking to my colleagues and talking to the board and talking to all our stakeholders, and Amnesty has 80 internal offices. So we often have webinars, just like I'm talking to you now, where we're talking to various regional offices and talking around the world. And they want to know exactly what are we doing at Amnesty International at the Centre, what are we grappling with, what are our priorities. And it was quite interesting how I started to hear the same words coming back to me, and everybody said, well, as Nigel has said, cash is king. So that gave me confidence, and that made me realise that the message had landed and people were thinking the same way. And that's what we had to think about. How do we survive through the next 6 months? So with that in mind, what we did was think about how do we make sure that we're maximising the use of our cash, and also identify what levers we may have to pull if we need to slow down certain payments. And work through the various lines in the cash forecast that we had and concentrated on those lines to put in mitigation and put in actions there to make sure that we didn't have problems moving forward. For us as an organisation, our source of income comes from our various countries that collect the sections, as we call them, that collect the actual assessment income and then pay that across to us. So in fact, for our organisation, we know that our top 13 sections, as we call them, represent 94% of our cash inflow. So we knew that we engaged with those top 13 sections on a regular basis and found out from them, how do they see the future? Do they feel that there's going to be any delays in terms of paying money across to us this year? And what are those delays? Then we can build that into our cash forecast, revise our cash forecast. So we set up regular monthly meetings with those sections, and we found that increased the amount of knowledge that finance had at the centre. And that was invaluable for us to be able to revise our cash forecasts and to produce scenarios. So we produce scenarios, as I'm sure everybody has done on this call. So we had a flat scenario, we had another scenario where we were anticipating a certain percentage drop in our income in 2021, and then another scenario where we're anticipating that there will be a further drop in income in years after 2021. But of course, the further that we go out, the less the certainty of those predictions. And the issues that we found then when we started to present this to the board and discuss this, that everybody was very nervous about what actions they should take and what are the priorities. So the pressure was certainly on the finance team to continually update our forecasts. And forecasting became the key area for the business and running scenarios. And in fact, it's very easy to start to talk very pessimistically and think about your worst scenarios and not think about, is there any light at the end of the tunnel? Are there any positive areas? And one thing we started to find after the first couple of months was actually, as some of those sections changed the way that they raised income and they started to move more to online income raising rather than face-to-face, that actually there were quite a few upsides. And they were starting to see that they were not having such a downturn in income, and their forward projections started to improve. That was the initial feedback that we got from those various areas. Also, as an organisation, at the same time as I said, we talk about prioritisation, we had a lot going on in our organisation. So we were right in the middle of implementing a new ERP project for both finance and for the HR systems. Also, we have a new strategy that's not completely finalised, and there are many other priorities on our list. So one thing that we did, and when the senior leadership team did, was to decide to have a crisis incident management team meets regularly on a weekly basis to ensure that we're handling everything relating to COVID-19. And part of that team's work is to think about forward planning and thinking, when would we be able to move back into our offices? And the latest information in that area is that we will have a phased return, and that they will start that from July, later this month, when, say, 60 people will move back into the office. And then there'll be a phased return in August. And the earliest we see that we'll have probably everybody back in the office will be September. So that's how we've coped, and I've coped with the prioritisation. And something I did have to deal with was handling the pressures from the board and stakeholders, where I found certain of those people really pushed me and wanted to know, well, what's happening to 2021? Have you done any planning for 2021? And I said, look, number one on my list is 2020 and survival. Once we've got a handle on that, we know where we are, we will immediately switch to 2021 and forwards.
Sorry, Nigel, I think we've been going back and forward through some of these slides, so I just want to make sure we're up to the right place.
We were moving on to cash management, I think, was the next.
I think you're a bit further ahead.
Yeah. Right, so we're back on cash management again. Sorry, you were talking about the returning to the office, and so I thought maybe I hadn't moved ahead quickly enough.
No, not a problem. No, I'd not raised the head. I was just mentioning that in terms of prioritisation.
Great.
So if we talk about cash management, as I say, was a key area, and the next 12 months cash forecast was key to us. And touching on again, we had to think about, well, what's the worst situation that could happen? And that was thinking about just how much of a decline could there be on the future income for us as an organisation. And we needed to know what that effect would be, and we need to know what that cash forecast was. We also needed to revisit our funding and think about, well, what funding do we have in place? And as an organisation, we were in the situation where we had not yet landed our funding for the next 12 months. Our funding was in a situation where we had an overdraft facility in place actually until today, the 30th of June, and we needed a new facility in place from the 1st of July. So when all this happened, it couldn't have happened at a worse time for us as an organisation, because we were in the middle of negotiating with the bank to land a facility for the next 12 months. We successfully did that. We explained everything to the bank. The bank, I would say this time, were a lot more cautious. Their credit committee asked a lot more questions, as you would expect them to do during COVID-19. And, you know, they had to be very sure that we were giving them all the scenarios and that we had all the mitigation in place to ensure that the level of facility that they were giving us was sufficient, and it gave us sufficient headroom. So we explained everything as I've just explained to you earlier in terms of prioritisation, working with all our sessions, making sure that they were giving us up-to-date information. The finance team were beavering away and working very hard on scenarios. A lot of pressure on the finance team, and I can't thank them enough. I mean, they certainly have been an area that during this crisis have definitely had to go a lot above and beyond and work very extraordinary hours and turn various pieces of work around in a very short time span. And that puts a lot of pressure on the team. And you know that you cannot help but realise just that unless you've got a really strong team by you and that they're a dedicated team, it's times like this during a crisis that then you appreciate just how good your team are, and how without them, you as the senior finance person would not be able to go back to the senior leadership team. You certainly couldn't go back to the board and give them an update. And all the time, the spotlight, I feel, was on finance, and it still is to today. So finance are right at the heart of the COVID-19 crisis in terms of providing updates and very much giving everybody a confidence that you are all over the numbers and that you've built in all the scenarios, the assumptions, you've been realistic with your assumptions, and that you've put everything in place in terms of mitigation. Something we did find, which was quite interesting, one of the upsides was, of course, due to lockdown, was that we suddenly found ourselves saving money in terms of travel spend. So that our budget figures for travel spend were not exceeded, and we had savings that were being made against that travel budget that we'd set at the beginning of the year. What we then decided to do as a senior leadership team was to rebadge that underspend and call it a COVID-19 pot. We then use that as a pot to use that funding and divert it to other areas of the business, particularly related to the COVID-19 situation, where we find there was a huge amount of pressure on my tech team. So there was a lot more work that the tech team had to do to help people to actually function and operate from home, similarly internationally. The use of tools like Zoom, and to make sure that we had all necessary security in place. Security was key. Amnesty as an organisation is constantly dealing with threats, and we always have people trying to break through our firewalls and get into the organisation. So the level of security is key and paramount for us as an organisation. Make sure on top of that. Another area, I'm careful how I say this, but in terms of a lever that can be pulled, of course, is to think about your payments to HMRC and think about VAT, PAYE, corporation tax. I mean, that is an area of last resort. But of course, if you are in a very difficult situation, cash flow wise, and that you see yourselves running into a negative cash flow situation, then don't leave it until the last minute. You need to start those conversations sooner, earlier than later, so that you can talk through with HMRC, make sure they understand the situation that you're in, share your cash flows with them, very transparent, and then they will work with you. I've done this many times in previous lives in many other businesses and had some very difficult conversations. But I have found if you talk to them sooner rather than later, then it gives them time to think about how they can help you and work with you. And they may give you a longer time to pay back some of the money that's owed to them. And if that makes a difference and that gives you that breathing space for you as an organization to survive, especially if you've exhausted all the other areas that you can use in terms of reducing your expenditure and increasing the amount of income that comes in, then it's very useful to be able to pull that lever and work with HMRC. We regularly update our cash flows, so we produce weekly cash flows. So during a time of crisis, it's key that you have the latest cash forecasts available. So the person who's working on the cash forecast is a key member of your team, and it's very important that you ensure they're not working too hard and there's not too much pressure on that individual, because everybody's waiting for them to produce those latest cash forecasts.
Great, thank you, Nigel. So another, well, it's always an important consideration, but becomes even more pertinent during a time of crisis, is the well-being of your workforce. And those of you that were paying attention would have already seen this slide as I was racing through them earlier. But Nigel, can you tell us a bit about what you've done to ensure the well-being of your workforce at Amnesty?
Yes, it was very easy, I have to say, very easy early on to focus on the priorities and completely forget the staff. Because you're running around as a senior finance person and you know you have deliverables, you know the pressure on you to perform, you know the pressures on your team, whether that be your finance team, your legal team, your workspace team, security, whatever that covers. So early on, I have to say my eye was not on the well-being of the staff. I had to quickly then switch, and I saw the staff becoming more and more pressured and working in a very pressured environment and working to very tight deadlines. We then quickly opened up the conversation, and when we had regular Zoom meetings or team meetings as we switched to, we would ask, well, what can we do to improve our well-being? And it's surprising once you open it up to your staff and you start talking to them, how they come up with many different ideas. So virtual birthdays started to happen, afternoon teas, quizzes, games, a lot of fun. And it was surprising how innovative people can be, even during lockdown. So it was surprising how many of these huddles and meetings were taking place. And then we started to open that up. So it didn't stay as just a finance thing, and people were not in silos. I thought that was very important. Look, if you've come up with ideas, you need to share this across the organization. We need to break down the barriers. And one of the positives of that, then I found that people were talking to other areas of the business, and then they didn't feel as isolated. One of the key points I think we discovered very early on is, of course, everybody is different. Some people are introverts, some people are extroverts. And what we found, of course, is those people who are extroverts are actually finding it very tough and very difficult because they're used to interacting. They're used to talking to people all the time, and particularly depending on their circumstances. If they're living on their own, or there aren't many people that they can talk to, and they're working, you know, from first thing in the morning till late at night, the interaction and the talking with colleagues is a key part of their day. And that is a key part to their mental well-being. So we very early on realised that those people were being affected. I think people who probably are more introverted and quite happy to work on their own and work in silos were not affected quite as much. Although again, we joined up regularly. We made sure that we were talking to each other. We had very frank conversations and asked people if there was anything what would concern them. I think early on, the concerns were very much about what's been termed Zoom fatigue, where people were finding it a different way of working and very tiring. I mean, I know I found that, even though I'm used to talking on many webinars and talking internationally at Amnesty, it's not the same as what we're doing now when we're switching the computer on first thing in the morning, and then you switch it off late at night, and everything is taking place through your PC screen. And that is very, very tiring. And particularly if you're in back-to-back meetings, where I find you're literally exiting one meeting with a list of to-dos, and then you're going straight into the next meeting and adding to your list of to-dos. And therefore the pressure on you as an individual to action those to-dos and keep everything moving is at a different level. I mean, I'm somebody, I'll be quite candid, who prides myself in staying on top of my emails and never allowing those to build up. Throughout my career, I've never allowed my inbox to build up. I've been very meticulous in keeping on top of that. I have to say, this is the first time in my career that during the COVID-19 crisis that I've just had to let that slip. I'm fortunate I do have a secretary to go through those emails, but I've just had to say, I just cannot physically keep on top of those emails. It is impossible because of the hours that I'm working and the pressure that we've all been working under with COVID-19. It's just not allowed that spare time to go through all those emails and keep on top of them. So I'm sure this resonates with those people who are listening to this webinar now, that's been an area that's had to be deprioritized. And that's something, you know, that we've had to do during this crisis, and think the same goes with the staff. I've had to say to the staff, you need to think, are there some tasks that you can deprioritize and they can wait until later on? They don't need to be delivered this month because of COVID-19 and what our new priorities are. And that's required people to really think long and hard, because, and particularly finance people, I would say, they find that difficult to do because they want to be high performing, they want to deliver. They don't want to say at the end of the day, well, I've only delivered 5 of the 8 items that were on my list. That's considered to be failure. But I would say during COVID-19, that's a success if you're delivering 5 of the 8 on your list. You just have to prioritize and work with that. So I think the next part on the well-being, I would say, is we're switching very much as an organization and the way we're managing the staff to think about moving and transitioning back into the office. We've had some drop-in sessions, which I joined one only last week because I thought, well, I'll join one of these sessions. It was run by somebody in HR. And I was actually very surprised to actually join that session and listen to some very frank concerns about some of those people who were discussing how they were very nervous about moving back into office. And they were mentioning all sorts of reasons why they're nervous about moving back into the office, which had not crossed my mind. And it wasn't something that I'd sat back and thought about as to, you know, well, surely it's just a case of as long as the office, we're distanced from each other and everybody thinks that we're COVID-19 fit, then why can't we suddenly start to move back into the office? And it really opened my eyes and made me realize that it is, for some people, it is going to be quite a big step to move from working in an office at home for 3 or 4 months to suddenly having to go onto public transport in some cases, and then arrive at an office and think about all the logistics in an office in terms of where you're working, meetings, the whole logistics about shower rooms, where you leave your bike, to actually going to the bathroom. I mean, when you start to open it up and then you think about the canteen, it is quite a logistical nightmare. So it really opened my eyes and made me realize that we need to take it very seriously and we need to take it a step at a time. And as an organization, we've already come to the conclusion that we're not going to force people back into the office. We're going to take it, say, one step at a time. And I'm sure it's going to be like, we're finding now coming out of lockdown, that it'll start to build, there'll be a momentum, and as people start to move back into the office and talk to their colleagues, then that will give confidence and that will make people feel less nervous about moving back into the office environment.
Great. Thank you, Nigel. So the next slide we have is internal and external communications.
Yes, communication was key during the actual COVID-19 crisis. And I found from day one, as the CFO, I was bombarded with questions, and so was the senior leadership team. And we had to be very quick at mobilizing ourselves and thinking about, well, what are those messages? What are we going to communicate? Who are we going to communicate it? And why are we going to communicate certain messages, and when are we going to communicate those messages? So it was all those questions that we had to ask ourselves. And something we did very quickly was to compile that list of both internal and external stakeholders. And because things moved at speed, I found at times you didn't have time to pause and think about what the messaging should be. And for instance, I suddenly found myself invited to a meeting whereby one of our major donors said, I want to speak to the CFO and I want to speak to him tomorrow because I want to know what's happening at Amnesty International. And obviously with a situation like that, you can't say, well, could you tell them I'm very busy at the moment and I'll come back to them next week? That's not an option. So that meeting went ahead, but I had to quickly find time in my diary, think about what the message should be to that donor, think about what was the latest information that I had as the CFO. And transparency, as it says on the screen, is key. So therefore, at that time, that was very early on in the process. I didn't have all the latest information in terms of what our future income forecasts were. I didn't know. I hadn't reached out. We hadn't had time to talk to all our various sections and find out around the world what their feelings were about the future and how COVID-19 was going to affect them. So I had to be very transparent with them and say, this is where we are, this is what we know, but this is what we're doing. And I think it's the what we're doing and the steps that we're taking that I found very early on immediately put people at ease, and it made those people, whether they be the board, members of the board, trustees, the Finance and Audit Committee, our auditors, the union, it made all those people then appreciate that we had a grip of the situation as senior management, and that we were thinking through very carefully and thoughtfully about what communication we should be delivering. And then we started to get into a regular series of presentations where we present to the staff, we present internationally to our offices, and preparation was key to all those communication sessions. As an organisation, Amnesty is extremely political, I would say, and it's an organisation where when you do give a presentation, particularly if it's a presentation where you're allowing questions and answers, questions from the floor, should I say, so that you are opening yourself up, just as a politician would be, to any question that can be asked. You have to think on your feet, and you have to think quickly. You don't have time to prepare for that. So we would, as a senior leadership team, we'd think about where we were as an organisation. We'd think about the latest information we had, what steps we've taken. We would work together. We would craft a communication. We'd decide on the best way to present that. We would not only, as I am doing now, obviously, have slides. We would also talk to the audience. We would open it up for questions. We might decide that the questions could be asked so we could manage it better at the end of that presentation rather than during the presentation, because then that kept the flow and that enabled us to deliver the message. Because one thing is, I would say, speaking from experience, is if you allow somebody to interrupt, then that you lose that flow, you lose the message. So it's very important that you manage that way that you communicate to everybody. We would also record the communication so that for those people who couldn't attend that particular webinar, they could play that back later. That would be on our intranet, so they could watch that later. We hold, because we're an international global organization, we'd have a communication session in the morning. We would also have one in the afternoon. So we made sure that we covered all bases, that we covered everybody in the organization. And we would allow people to have a chat, to capture all those questions in the chat. We'd circulate that would come back, and we'd go back and answer those questions afterwards. So it's something, an organization, being an international organization, we're quite used to that. I would say that when you have a live chat and then you answer those questions well at the same time, you've got to be very careful how you handle that, because if there's too many questions coming in, you can trip up. And also it might be that the same question is coming in, but worded a different way by different people in the organization. And therefore it's better if you can group questions into themes and you can answer those themes. That gives a much better outcome, I would say. So I think that's what I would say in terms of communication. The frequency of communication was key to us as an organization. We've had very good positive feedbacks. We check afterwards to check that people did understand the messages. I mean, a good test we found was, after we had delivered the messages, was, well, how many questions do we have now from those people who've actually attended this webinar? And, you know, as we've got into the rhythm of things, we've found there's been very few questions. And so, in fact, sometimes they said, well, we've got no questions at all on finance, which then at least made me feel as if, well, at least I must have got the message across. So that gave me comfort.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nigel. And before we go on to our final slide, I think you've just given us a nice segue into a participant question that Leanne's going to ask you.
Are you ready for it, Nigel?
Yes. Fire.
Brilliant. So is there any benefit coming out from the COVID-19 crisis that you could see, apart from online donation, that you will keep going forward when the situation goes back to normal?
Benefits we've learned from it, yes, if I've understood your question, yes, that we've seen, yes.
That you'll take forward into normal life again?
I would say definitely team working across the organisation, sharing our experiences, as I mentioned before, in terms of you know, the well-being messages that we've shared, rather than keep that in a silo. I would say that it's definitely fostered, I'm not saying that wasn't there before, but it's definitely fostered a feeling of we're all working together for the good of the organisation, for the survival of the organisation. So that has enabled people to prioritise. I would say people that are not used to prioritising, and unless you've been in a crisis situation, I would see this as a huge learning curve for those people. And I would hope that they take that forward as a way of working and think about how, to my earlier point, that you can't deliver everything, and you shouldn't try and deliver everything on your to-do list. You need to prioritize. You need to decide that, almost that, you know, if I can only deliver 3 things today, what are those 3 things I need to deliver today? And I think the COVID-19 crisis definitely really made people focus on it, because they didn't have a choice. They weren't able to say, well, I'll deliver everything. They had to quickly change their mindset. That's something. I would say for the finance department, it's probably, I would say they've had to perform at a higher level. They've had to perform very quickly. So definitely that's improved the way they work. I would say communication, we've just said that. I would say communication, we should continue. You might decide to dial that down a little bit and not communicate as frequently, but the communication across the organisation has been very welcome. And, you know, we found as an organisation that people have said, you know, this has really helped us to understand what's happening in the organisation. Whereas I'm sure everybody on this call appreciates that finance tries to serve everybody, and they try to keep everybody informed. And it can be very difficult to do that when you're trying to keep your board informed, your trustees, your non-exec, your finance and audit committee, other committees, the union, the auditors. You know, there's a long list of people, stakeholders, who you're trying to keep informed. And it's easy for one of those to drop between the cracks, and you forget. Don't keep them informed. So I would say this crisis has helped us to work in a different way.
Thank you. And we've got another related as well, if you're ready.
Yes.
Have you found that the not-for-profit sector has come closer together during this pandemic?
I have to say I've experienced that when I've been on webinars. And I've been at Amnesty for 12 months. So I do know there is a very good network within the not-for-profit sector. But I would say, if I'm being candid, I've not been in that many COVID-19 meetings where it's been the not-for-profit sector all around the table, other than specific webinars where that's happened. But I mean, to answer that question, there could be more of that. Oh, can I just answer the door 1 second? I'm sorry about this.
No worries.
I wasn't expecting that to happen, so just excuse me 1 second.
Sure, no worries, Nigel.
The joys of working from home.
And for our participants, there's one more slide, and then we'll be going through the Q&A, going through the questions that you've asked when registering for the webinar.
Okay, thank you. That was a live example of working from home, so I apologise for that. So, where were we there? Oh, you were talking about, yes, the not-for-profit sector. I think it's something that, in fact, going from here now, the issue is we've probably all been very busy on the day job and delivering, as I've said, the survival. So the question is, you know, how many people on this call, if there'd been a call, a webinar organised for everybody to come together, would have actually had the time during those first month or 2 months, should I say, actually join that webinar? Or were they firefighting? Were they in survival mode? So to answer that question. But that doesn't mean to say, I would say now, going forward, I've noticed working in this sector, and I've been in this sector for quite a while now, that we're very honest with each other. We're very, you know, we don't mind sharing confidential information because we trust each other. And I think if we can learn from other people in terms of how they've managed the situation, then that's good. And we should share that information, because we all want to survive. We shouldn't be keeping it to ourselves.
Thank you, Nigel. And I just said, as you were answering the door there, we've got one more slide, and then we're going to go through some of the questions that people asked as they were registering for the webinar. So can you talk us through your approach to stakeholder management now, please, Nigel? Yeah,
I mean, I have probably touched on that, but I'll say it again in terms of, I went through a list and thinking, who do I need to really make sure is informed during the COVID-19 crisis? So, you know, you start off internally, you start off with everybody internally in terms of senior management, your donors, your trustees, your board, the finance and audit committee. I mean, what I found, and it's added pressure to the finance department, but we've ended up with more finance and audit committee meetings than we had in the diary. We've ended up with more board meetings than we had in the diary. And that adds a lot of pressure, because, you know, holding a meeting isn't a case of suddenly pitching up at a meeting and saying, well, we'll just give you an update. It doesn't work that way, as we all know. Finance are expected to be professional. They're expected to have a presentation ready. They should have circulated that presentation, or whatever it is, 7 days or however many days, whatever the agreed number of days are before that meeting. That adds a lot of pressure. And if we think about our own sector, have you got the capacity? Have you got the actual resource in your area to be able to service that demand? And I'm sure, you know, some organisations just do not have that, and therefore it's not fair to expect them to arrive at that meeting with a, should we say, a PowerPoint deck for every one of those meetings. And I know that will be accepted, and therefore, to me, as long as you're prepared and you're able to speak verbally and give an update, that's acceptable. So we shouldn't beat ourselves up over that. That's something that you know, as long as you're giving an update and keeping those stakeholders informed, that's what matters. And we've done that with the union. We've kept them informed. We have regular meetings with the union and with the staff. I mean, early on in this area, of course, one of the key concerns that we noticed, and it links into the wellbeing area, which I didn't mention, was suddenly everybody found that they were reading, seeing on the news and reading on the internet, on the television, that many organisations were laying staff off and making staff redundant. That sent shockwaves, of course, across all different businesses, and we were no different to that, to any other business. And therefore, very early on, the staff were starting to become very nervous in terms of wanting to know, you know, are we an organisation that's going to be affected by that? How many staff are going to lose their jobs? So we had to handle that whole situation in terms of the wellbeing area, in terms of the stakeholder management. And that was very important. I mean, that cut right across to wellbeing, to communication, to stakeholder management. So that was a key area, and I'm sure everybody else on this call has gone through that, and they may still be going through that difficult area.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Just before we move on to the next section, which is the questions, we've got 17 minutes left, and the questions may well overrun because there's a few very good questions here. So I know that everyone's busy, and anyone that needs to leave at 11, I'll just say it now. Nigel's got a book coming out soon, which we're going to share. Sorry, it's out already, isn't it, Nigel?
It is out already, yes. Been published, yes.
So we're going to share the details of this presentation, which include everything that Nigel's gone through today, but also the information on that book. And also, just to let you know, Nigel, that Altum Consulting are going to be making a donation to Amnesty International for, well, as a token of our appreciation for you spending your time doing this today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's an unexpected message. I wasn't expecting that.
Well, it's the very least we could do. And thank you again. But we'll move on to the questions now. And I think Leanne's going to go first on that.
So the first one is, how has Amnesty's fundraising portfolio been affected to date by COVID-19, and what are its expected impacts on the different fundraising streams? Well,
that's obviously one of the most important questions to ask. I'm glad we've asked that first. Early on for us, as we started to speak to those various sections and speak around the world, we realised that face-to-face, as we call it, face-to-face fundraising, was affected because, of course, people were just not on the streets, people were not out there. So that was where initially we were hearing very negative information from all those sections, and early on they just had not, I mean, it's true to say that they've not really got their heads around that on what's the solution, how are we going to solve this. until they sat down and then started to think, well, we need to switch to telemarketing. So they did switch to telemarketing, and once we had those early successes, we spread that across the organisation, and more countries joined in, and there's some very good news came through in terms of the actual outcome of switching to telemarketing. I mean, something I can say, that 3 particular countries that found that particularly more difficult was the UK, the US, as you would expect, and Australia, to call out 3. The US, I would say, has hit more than anybody, particularly as we know that, I mean, from day one they were hit, and there doesn't seem any sign of the let up there. Whenever I talk to the US as a fundraising organization, they you know, the actual, there's so much nervousness in terms of the effect of COVID-19. And as we all know, if we read the press today, that's not going away in terms of infection in the US. There are many problems there across many states who chose to end the lockdown earlier. And also they have a huge question mark over their future political situation, in terms of it being a year when there is an election and the uncertainty that's attached to that. So I'm sure for those organisations who are dependent on fundraising in the US, that is something that will resonate with them. But I think the key point is sharing the best practices and sharing the best information. And that's what we've done. And I'm fortunate in Amnesty, we have somebody who's very good with the analytics and loves to produce graphs and all the various infographics. And that's something that when you can present that information, going back to the earlier point about stakeholders, they love to see all the graphs and see the information, because it shows them that we're on top of the data that we're receiving.
Thank you, Nigel. The next question we have, and this is a good question as well. What has been the hardest decision you've had to make so far?
I think the hardest decision would be, the decision was during this year with, I mean, it links into COVID-19, but in terms of the amount of budget that we had to land on for this year, because last year was a financial recovery situation in Amnesty, and this is a continuation of that. So with the COVID-19 crisis coming along, that's meant that we've had to really tighten the purse strings. We've had to manage our costs very tightly. So it is a difficult decision. Well, one area that which I didn't touch on earlier, is that we decided that we had vacancies in our organisation. So in the organogram for the organisation, the number of roles, and we decided that we would keep those vacancies open. We would not recruit to them, because if we did that, it would maintain our staff costs, and staff costs are a large part of our cost base, as I'm sure they are in other not-for-profit organisations. We're all in the same situation. And why is it a hard decision? Because of, well, what are the implications? The implications for that are, there are bound to be some of those roles that affect what we deliver as an organisation. And therefore, that means that we will have some very difficult conversations across the organisation in terms of explaining why can we not recruit to some of those roles at the moment. And that's a difficult call, but it needs to be explained. We need to be transparent, and we need to hope that things will improve in the future, and then we'll be able to revisit that area.
Brilliant, thank you. So next one we have is, how do we improve cooperation between organisations providing similar or the same services within an area?
I think that's all about networking and bringing those different areas together to make sure that they are working together and they're aligned, because it is very easy for different areas to work in a silo and work to their own priorities. And that goes back to the earlier comments we made on this webinar, where if we're all aligned, we all agree what the priorities are, then it should be very easy, and it should be easy that we're all working together to deliver that. I mean, we've had that in Amnesty, for instance, where I found the spotlight has very much been on the technology area, whereby there's been a large call for certain tech to intervene to help us to deliver as a consequence of COVID-19, whether that be in security or in the actual software that we use. So because that's been a key area that we're agreed that we need to get through the crisis, then to me, that's brought everywhere together so that we're all aligned. And that's helped finance then to decide, well, we need to find the funds to enable that to happen. So that if the budget wasn't sufficient, as an example, which it wasn't in Amnesty, the budget for this year, we then tapped into what I referred to earlier, this COVID-19 pot, which was made up of some underspends that we'd managed to ring fence from underspends in terms of travel expenditure across the organisation. And then we explained to everybody, we're going to use that money in the tech area, and this is what we're going to deliver as a consequence. So that was a positive outcome that everybody benefited by.
Thank you, Nigel. The next question is slightly longer, so bear with me. What has been the most effective form of communication with your Board of Trustees during the crisis? We have changed the format and regularity of our board meetings and subcommittees, but still find it difficult to provide timely and effective information during this time. It is crucial the board supports our decisions and the financial impact, but we find the balance between too much detail and the ever-changing horizon a difficult juggling act.
Yeah, that is a long question, and I understand why it's a long question. It is a juggling act. I agree with what the questioner is asking here, and it's a fine balance. I found myself at a board meeting at which I thought as CFO, my team has gone above and beyond, and we provided, a great deal of information, and therefore we've done everything we possibly can. Only to hear back the question, well, we need more information, and for the next board meeting, could you provide more information on this income, and could you give us more granularity on this? And therefore, you hear those comments coming back, and you think, well, when does this stop? And I don't think it will stop, because of course, my feeling is because of the uncertainty, unfortunately, finance is in the headlights, and it's finance who has to pull all this information together, and finance has to be the messenger and continue to feed those various committees, the trustees, as we said, and the board. You can't give too much information, other than the fact then if I may be cynical here, you give too much information, then that information arrives too late for the meeting, and then it's well I've not had time to read all this information because it's only arrived 2 days before the board meeting. So you can't win in some of those situations. You've just got to grin and bear it, I would say. And to answer the question, well, what's the best form? I think if you haven't got time, going back to my earlier point, to provide should we say, what we all love to do, a PowerPoint presentation, then maybe a short, crisp email with short bullets, but at least gives the headlines, that could be circulated to those people. And then at the end of it, you could say, look, this is a short, quick update. If you have any other questions and any other questions you'd like to ask me, then please come back and my team will come back to you with the answers. But there's a lot going on at the moment. We're all extremely busy, but I thought I'd give you a few bullet points and give you a quick update. So at least you feel that you have been kept abreast of what's happening in the organisation and what we're doing. And I have done that, and I found that's worked, and that's been very appreciative. And particularly I found that's been useful whereby you may have trustees who don't meet on a regular basis. They might meet, say, every 4 months. So if you sent an update, perhaps during COVID-19 on a monthly basis, they're very appreciative of that. And they have come back to me and said, thank you for that information. We really do now feel that you're keeping us up to date.
Thank you. And I think you might have touched on this one a little bit with regard to the COVID-19 pot, etc. But I'll go ahead with it anyway. What are your focus areas for cost reduction?
I have touched on it. Travel was obviously a key area. I mean, that was what we call a low-hanging fruit. That was easy because, of course, with travel restrictions, people weren't able to spend. But we all know what budget holders are, and budget holders don't want to give up their budget. So it does require some, should we say, persuasion and some negotiation with their budget holders to give up some of their underspends. If they give that up, and if they know how that money is going to be used, then I believe that budget holders will engage and they will do that. The other area was staff costs. I touched that because that's a large cost for us in terms of our cost profile. We manage that very, very tightly in terms of we have capped the number of headcount that the organisation is working to. And we've even gone one step further because I've done this in other organisations. We have a committee which approves every single recruitment. So every single new recruitment, whether that be a recruitment for permanent recruitment or a fixed term contract, or even somebody using a consultant in the organisation, has to go through a particular committee, and they have to present their business case, and then that committee approves it. Finance input into that decision-making process so that we know, is it included in budget? If it's not included in budget, how is it going to be funded? What's the purpose of that cost? What is that person going to deliver? Why is it so essential that we bring that individual into the organisation at this point? Do they need to come in now? Could they come in a few months' time? And then again, because of COVID-19, we've actually had saving of what we call in programme costs or activity costs. So similarly, we've had discussions in terms of if there are any underspends there, that we can actually use that underspend elsewhere, or do we want to have a conversation and do we want to say we'll allow you to roll this forward to later on in the year and use it then? But again, we want to have that healthy, very transparent conversation with the budget holder so that money is not wasted and we're managing the costs in the organisation.
Thank you, Nigel. Next question. How do you feel that the charity sector could better use artificial intelligence and other digital technology? And what would be the best area to focus investment on? Which digital skills do finance teams need to be equipped with?
I've had experience in this particular area, particularly with AI. In cancer research, we implemented a chatbot, which was an automated question and answer function for the procurement department. And there's a lot of work that had to go into that, I will say. It took a lot of time between the procurement manager and a tech to implement it, but it was beneficial at the end of the day. It's something that could be used in another area. Another area we were thinking of, which we never moved on to, was questions on VAT, where you may have somebody who answers many questions on VAT. It releases people. I think it's something you need to look at and think about how much time and investment is required and what saving there would be in terms of your existing headcount. And when I say saving, I don't mean a reduction in headcount, but I mean freeing up their time so that they can deliver other valuable work rather than answering questions all the time. Quickly moving over to your other question, which was what training. I would say the key area of training would be in terms of fundraising. So to use all the digital tools that are out there, particularly I would say it's good to be trained in things like Google Ads, analytics, Facebook ads, content marketing, SEO and more. And that's probably something that everybody in the marketing space is very familiar with. But I don't think there's any harm in somebody in the finance team, and perhaps somebody in the finance team who is involved in the marketing side of the business or the marketing budget, to learn those skills. So they then see, are we using the budget appropriately? Are we spending money in that area? Is it a good use of funds of this organisation? And then does it have the return? Is the return on the investment so that perhaps investing in that area does bring more fundraising into the organisation, which at the end of the day, that's the acid test.
Thank you. I've just had one question from the chat asking if the sound has dropped off. So just wanted to see if everyone else can hear okay, if it's an isolated incident, if they want to
iPhone user
respond
raised
on the
hand.
webinar chat. Okay. Most other people can hear fine, not a problem. Okay, it's all good. We can move on to the next one. Thank you. So the next question is from myself, and it's, what are the top 3 things to do first to aim to secure financial survival?
In terms of survival, I would say, well, you have to get a grip of all your costs. So you need to control all your costs and make sure that people are not just spending money and you haven't got control. You need to make sure that's within the budget, or the revised budget, the revised forecast. Because I'm sure everybody on this call has produced a revised forecast for this year, particularly as a consequence of COVID-19. The other area you'd move on to, which we mentioned in my opening statement, which was cash. Cash is king. You need to make sure that you're on top of your cash forecast. You need to make sure you have a sufficient cash balance, that you're managing your cash very tightly, you have sufficient funding in place, and that you're doing everything you possibly can to, maybe you want to ask some of the people, if you're in a situation where you can ask somebody to pay you earlier rather than the normal payment date, then that might help cash flow. Another area is, a key area is to make sure that you're building reserves. Obviously, organisations now that been hit COVID-19, if they didn't have sufficient reserves already in their balance sheet, then of course they found out at their cost that those reserves have not been built up. So in fact, they found they're in a difficult situation. But the cash balance is what you survive with. It's how much cash you have and whether you can pay your suppliers, and more importantly, you can pay your staff every month. And that was something early on as well. I didn't say this, the communication. I made sure that I told our staff and made sure that everybody knew we have enough money in our bank account to be able to pay you at the end of this month and to be able to pay our suppliers.
Thank you, Nigel. I've got another long one here for you. So again, please bear with me. It can often be extremely challenging for finance directors to influence change within their own organisations, despite all too obvious and well-communicated financial sustainability risks or insufficient reserves. Often, it can feel like warnings from finance fall on deaf ears, and until there is a genuine crisis, there is no burning platform for change. How can finance directors better influence CEOs or their leadership peers such that significant change doesn't only come off the back of a crisis, which unfortunately often leads to blame feeling laid with the very finance departments who have been warning of risks for sometimes years?
Okay, to me, that requires you to make sure that you build trust, if you haven't done already, with your CEO and with the senior leadership team, so that they listen to the FD. And I've been many times, because I'm a career interim, I know what it's like to walk into an organisation where the CEO or perhaps the senior leadership team doesn't respect finance, doesn't listen to the FD, and actually they might ask you a question and then you give an answer and then you move on to something else. So that's painful. I've got the scars, I've got the t-shirt, so I know what it's like. You've got to build that trust, and you do that by engaging with those people, talking to them, and also providing them with good financial data. And through that, through good financial data, it might be pictorial, it might be an infographic. You also use that to show them what the benefits are and the added value by making certain decisions to the organization. And once you, as I would call it, win them over, and they accept, you know, they give you trust, and they trust the data, and they value the added value that the finance team makes, then you find suddenly there is light at the end of the tunnel, and that they will listen to you, and they will come to you. You'll be the person that they will come and ask you in difficult situations. And that's what you need to be, that right-hand man or woman for the CEO.
Thank you.
Just 3 more questions we've got. What do you see as the FD's role in a restructure and in scenario planning at a high level for a global organisation?
Well, it's pivotal. The FD needs to be right at the centre of that, because it affects the future, as we said earlier, the future success of that organisation, the financial sustainability of that organisation. It's no good anybody who's working on that project to do it without you being sat at that table. You need to be right there. You need to have a seat at that table. You need to work with everybody, and you need to be trusted. You need to have the input and work with those individuals, so you come out with a successful restructure for that organisation, which makes that organisation survive and continue into the future.
Thank you, Nigel. With key developments in COVID-19 regulations, do you see scope to combine approaches across various countries for community-led projects? And how do we adapt rather than abandon or delay projects?
There is scope. I would say there, to me, it's finding the common denominator. It's finding the common theme. Because if you find the common theme of what you want the outcome to be, and particularly in our area, not for profit, if say it's reducing poverty in a particular country, and that's one of your metrics, then immediately that resonates and you can work to deliver that metric. So then it's about how do you progress that forward.
Right, thank you. And I think we're on to our final question, other than the chat, which we'll check in a moment. On to you, Leanne.
Yep. So, how do you balance short-term cost control with the need to invest over long horizons and generate future growth in the current climate?
That is extremely difficult. That is a dilemma in the sense that if you make the wrong decision, then in the future, when you move forward, people will point the finger at you and say you made the wrong decision, and that's affecting us as an organisation. Quick example of that is it might be that it's said that you should invest more in tech now because we need to do something which will help us with the COVID-19 crisis now. And then if you decide, well, we can't afford to do it because we need to invest the money somewhere else, that is a choice. And that's something that management have to grapple with and weigh up each of those decisions and make an informed commercial decision and think about what the implications are and be able to stand by that decision going forward. But it is quite possible that a decision might be made that has back to your point in the question, a long-term effect on the organisation, and therefore I would say that you need to then record that somewhere and go back to it as soon as budget or funding might allow you to readdress that situation.
Thanks very much, Nigel. Thank you again for a brilliant and informative presentation and for taking the time to answer all these questions. And just finally, before we conclude, why don't you tell us a bit about your book?
Well, my book is called Secrets to Career Success. I'm passionate. One of my passions is helping people in an interview situation. I know everybody hates interviews. I've been an interviewer many times, hundreds of times. I've interviewed people internationally in the Middle East, in Europe, and in the UK for many different roles. I've also been interviewed myself many times, particularly as I've been an interim myself for over 40 years. So I've probably worked in more organisations than many people have. So I've had to attend all those interviews. That's been my choice. So I feel that I know what all the tips are to help you win at an interview. And this book is something that will help you win at your next interview, should give you confidence to win that interview. There are many tips in there, and also there are some templates for career advice. So good luck.
Brilliant, thank you. So we're going to share this presentation with all the attendees today, and we'll put a link to Nigel's book on that email as well. You'll have mine and Leanne's email addresses if there's any further questions you'd like to ask either of us or Nigel. Thank you all for participating today, particularly as we've overrun by 10 minutes or so. And Nigel, thank you once again. As mentioned, as a token of our appreciation, we'll be making a donation to Amnesty International today.